How WWE abandoned Josh Bredl is a documented history of sanctioned workplace hazing and severe medical negligence. After winning a $250,000 Tough Enough contract, executives placed him in a hostile training environment where public bullying by veterans was completely ignored. Subjected to physical abuse, Bredl sustained severe concussions. Instead of providing necessary neurological care, the company froze his medical status. In 2017, executives quietly fired him while he was still suffering from brain trauma simply to avoid paying for his workplace injuries. This is the cold reality of corporate liability. The production environment inside the Full Sail University arena in August 2015 was meticulously engineered to broadcast a manufactured moment of triumph. Under the intense glare of the television lighting grids, 24-year-old Josh Bredl stood in the center of a professional wrestling ring. Confetti fell from the rafters as the live audience cheered the conclusion of the 6th season of World Wrestling Entertainment's reality television program, Tough Enough. The voting metrics displayed on the broadcast indicated a landslide victory, with Bredl securing an overwhelming 70% of the interactive public vote. The physical prize handed to him on live television was a 1-year developmental contract valued at $250,000. To the millions of viewers consuming the USA Network broadcast, the imagery represented the ultimate sanitized realization of the American dream. Bredl was presented as a young, charismatic, exceptionally gifted athlete whose raw physical potential had been rightfully recognized and rewarded. He had seemingly bypassed the grueling, anonymous decades of physical sacrifice required by the independent wrestling circuit, stepping directly from the reality television bubble into the global corporate spotlight. The narrative sold to the public was one of merit and opportunity. The reality operating behind the television cameras was fundamentally different. The corporate executive shaking his hand on the broadcast understood that the $250,000 contract was not merely a reward for generating reality television ratings. It was a highly visible, deliberately placed target on his back. The extreme volatility of the environment Bredl was entering becomes fully apparent only through a forensic examination of the professional wrestling locker room's deeply entrenched, highly defensive psychology. The industry operates on an archaic, unwritten, and strictly enforced code known as paying dues. The veterans occupying the WWE main roster and the upper echelons of the developmental system had not arrived via television casting calls. They had spent 10 to 15 years destroying their bodies in dilapidated high school gymnasiums and freezing armories. They had driven hundreds of thousands of miles across the country for negligible financial compensation, suffering severe, untreated orthopedic trauma simply to secure an audition for the corporate monopoly. They possessed bodies heavily compromised by years of taking unprotected impacts on thinly padded wooden rings, often operating in a state of permanent financial anxiety. Within this specific traumatized ecosystem, television time and roster spots are strictly finite resources. Professional wrestling is a zero-sum economic game. If a new performer is granted 5 minutes of television exposure, those 5 minutes must be directly extracted from an established veteran. When the corporate management parachuted an inexperienced reality television contestant into this highly paranoid environment and publicly handed him a guaranteed salary that vastly exceeded the downside guarantees of many seasoned professionals. It was an act of corporate provocation. It triggered an immediate violent immune response from the established workforce. Josh Bredl was entirely unequipped to detect or navigate this impending political warfare. His entire athletic framework was built upon his background as a defensive lineman for the Colorado State Rams. Collegiate and professional American football operate as strict, objective meritocracies. In a football locker room, athletes are united by a singular, tangible objective: winning the game. If a highly recruited rookie enters the defensive line and performs at an elite level, the entire team benefits. The defense stops the opposition, the team secures the victory, and collective success translates into bowl games, championships, and shared financial rewards. In that environment, a talented rookie is an asset to be integrated and protected by the veterans. Bredl assumed he was transitioning into a similar athletic environment. He believed he was entering an advanced training academy where he would learn the mechanics of a new performance art under the guidance of industry veterans. He fundamentally misread the architecture of his new profession. A professional wrestling locker room is not a team. It is a hyper-competitive, fiercely territorial hierarchy where survival frequently dictates the active sabotage of one's peers. The veterans did not view his $250,000 contract as a victory for the company. They viewed it as a direct insult to their years of unpaid physical suffering and a threat to their future earning potential. The most insidious element of this dynamic was the active complicity of the World Wrestling Entertainment Executive Board. The management team operating out of Stamford, Connecticut, possessed decades of experience manipulating locker room psychology. They were acutely aware that dropping a highly paid, fundamentally untrained outsider into a developmental system populated by embittered veterans would instantly ignite a volatile, hostile reaction. Rather than deploying human resources protocols to insulate their new multi-million-dollar television investment, the management actively weaponized the hostility. They utilized the reality television contract not as a protective shield, but as an accelerant. The corporate strategy heavily relied on the concept of breaking an incoming talent to test their psychological threshold. The executives needed to know if the reality show winner possessed the mental endurance to survive the unique miseries of the industry before committing long-term television resources to his development. By publicly announcing the massive monetary value of his contract, the executives intentionally bypassed standard corporate onboarding. They effectively outsourced their disciplinary procedures and stress testing to the most aggressive members of their own workforce. They placed the rookie in a gladiator pit, handed him a bag of money to ensure the resentment of his peers was operating at maximum capacity, and stepped back to observe the outcome. Bredl walked out of the Full Sail University arena, believing he had won a competition. He was entirely unaware that the reality television show was merely the bait, and he had just stepped into a corporate machine explicitly designed to turn him into a scapegoat. The illusion of a regulated, professional, corporate environment at World Wrestling Entertainment is meticulously maintained by its physical architecture. When Josh Bredl reported to the WWE Performance Center in Orlando, Florida, he walked into a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art athletic facility. The building featured 7 pristine wrestling rings, world-class strength and conditioning equipment, sports medicine suites, and extensive film study rooms. It was designed to mirror the elite training complexes of the National Football League or major collegiate sports programs. This physical presentation is a crucial component of the corporate facade, suggesting to investors and new recruits alike that the company operates with the safety, oversight, and human resources protocols standard in modern billion-dollar monopolies. The internal culture operating within those walls, however, was fundamentally divorced from modern corporate ethics. Beneath the polished veneer of the Performance Center lay an archaic, predatory social structure. Bredl, operating under the assigned corporate moniker Bronson Matthews, arrived at the facility carrying the invisible heavy burden of his highly publicized $250,000 reality television contract. He was already a marked man, surrounded by peers and veterans who viewed his existence as an insult to their own decades of poorly compensated suffering. The locker room was a powder keg of deeply ingrained institutional resentment. All that was required to trigger a catastrophic detonation was a single misinterpreted spark. That spark occurred in January 2016, originating from a digital platform that the corporation actively encouraged its performers to utilize. During a live broadcast of the flagship television program, Monday Night Raw, WWE introduced a newly formed faction of wrestlers, dubbed the Social Outcasts. The group consisted of performers who were historically utilized to lose matches, banded together in a comedic underdog narrative. Bredl, watching the broadcast and attempting to adhere to the corporate mandate of building an interactive online presence, decided to comment on the new faction via Twitter. He was attempting to participate in the ongoing television narrative, adopting a slightly arrogant, antagonistic tone that he believed aligned with his developing heel or villainous character. He posted a brief, seemingly innocuous comment. "Yup, I like it. #socialjobbers." To a civilian or a casual television viewer, the hashtag was merely a play on words, a harmless observation regarding the fictional status of the characters on screen. Within the deeply insular, highly sensitive lexicon of professional wrestling, however, Bredl had just committed the ultimate unforgivable transgression. He had invoked the word jobber. The visceral, violent reaction this single word triggered is deeply rooted in the etymology and the immense psychological weight of the term within the industry. Jobber is the colloquial backstage designation for an enhancement talent, a performer whose explicit contractual purpose is to lose matches cleanly and convincingly to elevate the status of another, more highly valued star. Performing the duties of a jobber is an essential respected mechanism within the choreographed mechanics of the business. However, the term itself is fiercely protected. It is viewed as an internal, highly classified designation. When veterans use the term amongst themselves, it is an acknowledgement of the harsh economic realities of their trade. When a rookie with zero in-ring experience, who had never taken a bump on a live tour and who had just been handed a massive reality television contract, publicly applied that term to veterans who had bled for the industry for over a decade, it was interpreted as an act of staggering disrespect. The veterans did not view Bredl's tweet as an attempt to build a fictional character. They viewed it as a wealthy, unearned interloper, actively mocking the men who were sacrificing their bodies to sustain the very industry he had just invaded. The retaliation was immediate, coordinated, and executed with a level of public cruelty that exposes the absolute hypocrisy of the WWE management structure. The digital execution was not carried out by low-level developmental trainees. It was spearheaded by some of the most prominent, highly compensated main roster stars in the company. Performers such as Kevin Owens and Cody Rhodes, individuals who wielded immense backstage influence and millions of social media followers, publicly eviscerated Bredl on Twitter. They mocked his reality television background, explicitly told him to respect the business, and directed the collective rage of the global wrestling fan base squarely at the 24-year-old rookie. This digital mob mentality served a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a public defense of the industry's sacred traditions. Beneath the surface, it was a highly visible, coordinated bullying campaign designed to systematically dismantle the confidence of the newcomer. A billion-dollar corporation that actively promotes anti-bullying campaigns in its public relations literature simultaneously allowed its top executives and stars to orchestrate the digital humiliation of an entry-level trainee. The Human Resources Department did not issue memorandums demanding professionalism. The talent relations executives did not step in to mediate the conflict or protect their new investment. They remained entirely silent, effectively signaling to the locker room that the reality television winner was unprotected and open for complete psychological dismantling. The digital humiliation, however, was merely the preliminary phase of the punishment. When Bredl physically returned to the WWE Performance Center in Orlando, the digital hostility violently manifested into physical and psychological exile. He was subjected to the most archaic, toxic mechanism of internal locker room control, wrestler's court. Wrestler's court is not a formal, documented disciplinary procedure. Operating completely outside any official WWE employee handbook, this functioned as an illegal, management-sanctioned system of kangaroo justice utilized to enforce the unwritten rules of the locker room without requiring the corporate executives to dirty their hands. In this entirely unregulated judicial system, veteran performers assumed the roles of judge, prosecutor, and jury. The accused is frequently denied the right to defend themselves, and the punishments are handed down based entirely on the emotional whims and bruised egos of the established hierarchy. The existence of wrestler's court is the ultimate indictment of the corporate culture within professional wrestling. It is a mechanism designed specifically to bypass modern labor laws and human resources protections. It allows the corporation to maintain a brutal, fear-based control over its independent contractors by outsourcing the intimidation to the performers themselves. The management turns a blind eye to the harassment, maintaining plausible deniability while reaping the benefits of a deeply subjugated, easily controlled workforce. The sentence handed down by the locker room tribunal against Josh Bredl was absolute excommunication. The veterans collectively decided that he was no longer permitted to occupy the same physical space as the men he had allegedly disrespected. The execution of this sentence was designed to inflict maximum psychological degradation. When Bredl arrived at the facility, he discovered that his personal belongings, his training gear, and his equipment had been physically removed from the men's locker room and callously thrown into the public hallway. He was explicitly banned from entering the dressing room, the showers, and the communal areas where performers gathered to discuss matches and build the critical trust required for their profession. To ensure the exile was absolute, the locker room hierarchy utilized the corporate infrastructure to enforce their mob rule. Bredl allegedly received an automated email from the facility's internal system, formally revoking his access privileges to the locker room. This specific detail is a terrifying exposure of corporate complicity. A group of independent contractors cannot alter the digital security access of a multi-million-dollar corporate facility without the direct authorization and active assistance of the facility management. The WWE administration did not simply look the other way while Bredl was bullied. They actively facilitated his exile, utilizing their own security systems to lock him out of the designated changing areas. For weeks, the 24-year-old athlete was subjected to profound daily humiliation. He was forced to change into his wrestling gear in public corridors, isolated from his peers, and treated as a pariah within the very building where he was supposed to be learning his craft. This environment of absolute isolation creates a terrifying occupational hazard. Professional wrestling requires a performer to entrust their physical safety and frequently their life to the hands of the person standing across from them in the ring. The mechanics of a suplex or a pile driver require absolute cooperation. Bredl was being forced to step into the ring and physically surrender his body to a locker room of men who openly despised him, who had publicly humiliated him, and who had systematically stripped him of his dignity. This sustained campaign of psychological warfare is designed to induce extreme mental fatigue. The victim is trapped in a state of permanent hypervigilance, constantly scanning their environment for the next insult, the next act of exclusion, or the next physical retaliation during a training drill. The corporation had successfully utilized the resentment of the veterans to break the rookie's spirit. They had transformed the massive financial reward of the tough enough contract into a psychological prison. Bredl was completely isolated, physically and emotionally exhausted by the constant harassment and entirely devoid of corporate protection. The psychological architecture had been successfully dismantled. The system had successfully stripped away his confidence, leaving him deeply vulnerable and desperately trying to prove his worth to a locker room that had already decided he was worthless. This deliberate, engineered state of mental exhaustion set the perfect catastrophic stage for the physical devastation that was about to follow. The transition from psychological isolation to physical destruction is not a coincidence within the architecture of the professional wrestling developmental system. It is a direct engineered sequence of cause and effect. When a human being is subjected to a sustained campaign of locker room exile, digital humiliation, and the constant suffocating paranoia of being universally despised by their peers, the central nervous system enters a state of permanent, exhausting hyperarousal. The brain is continuously flooded with cortisol. Sleep patterns disintegrate. The fundamental ability to concentrate is shattered. Josh Bredl stepped into the wrestling rings at the WWE Performance Center carrying this massive psychological burden, operating in a state of severe cognitive fatigue. In an industry where absolute split-second physical focus is the only barrier against catastrophic injury. Deploying an exhausted, deeply distracted rookie into a high-intensity training drill is a calculated endangerment of human life. The training methodology deployed against Bredl during this period has been characterized by those who witnessed it as operating under a psychopathic philosophy. The objective of the coaching staff was no longer to educate the reality television winner. The objective was to physically break him, to test whether his highly publicized $250,000 contract could insulate him from the brutal, archaic hazing rituals of the old guard. The trainers subjected him to extreme punitive cardiovascular conditioning. He was forced to run drills until his lungs burned and his muscles reached the point of absolute trembling failure. Abandoning the strategic progressive overload utilized by modern sports science, this regimen served merely as a blunt force instrument of physical torture, disguised as a training curriculum, designed to strip away his physical defenses before the actual wrestling even began. Once his body was heavily fatigued, Bredl was ordered to execute continuous high-impact bumping drills. The physical reality of a professional wrestling ring is heavily obscured by the theatrical presentation on television. The canvas does not possess the forgiving deep foam structure of a gymnast's landing mat. It is a thin layer of tightly stretched canvas overlaying a thin, dense pad resting directly atop wooden planks reinforced by heavy steel beams. When a 280-pound athlete like Bredl falls backwards from a standing position, the kinetic energy generated by the sudden deceleration is massive. To survive this impact without sustaining severe internal trauma, the performer must utilize perfectly ingrained muscle memory. They must spread their surface area to distribute the shock wave, tighten their core, and critically aggressively tuck their chin to their chest to prevent the back of their skull from violently whipping into the wood and steel beneath the canvas. Bredl, deprived of sleep, psychologically tormented, and physically pushed past the point of exhaustion by the psychopathic conditioning drills, lost the ability to perfectly execute this vital defensive mechanism. The muscles in his neck, fatigued from the extreme cardio and the stress of his locker room exile, failed to hold the heavy weight of his head during a sequence of brutal repetitive falls. Rather than a single visually spectacular accident, the injury manifested as the insidious compounding devastation of blunt force trauma to the brain. The human brain is not securely fastened to the interior of the skull. It is suspended in cerebrospinal fluid, designed to cushion minor, everyday movements. When Bredl's head repeatedly struck the unforgiving ring mat, the sudden deceleration caused his brain to violently crash against the hard interior bone of his own skull. The soft neural tissue was bruised, stretched, and torn with every subsequent impact. He sustained a severe, high-grade concussion. However, the damage extended far beyond the standard, temporary neurological disruption of a typical sports injury. The repeated, unprotected impacts caused the delicate blood vessels surrounding his brain to rupture. Blood began to leak and pool outside the blood vessels within the cranial cavity. Bredl had developed a hematoma, an active brain bleed. In the realm of legitimate regulated contact sports, a subdural or epidural hematoma is classified as a massive, life-threatening medical emergency. It mandates an immediate cessation of all physical activity, urgent transport to a neurological trauma center, comprehensive imaging scans, and frequently invasive emergency surgery to relieve the escalating intracranial pressure before the pooling blood permanently crushes the brainstem or causes irreversible cognitive death. Within the sterile multi-million-dollar walls of the WWE Performance Center, this catastrophic neurological event was met with a chilling, bureaucratic indifference. When the severity of his cognitive decline, the blinding headaches, and the extreme sensitivity to light made it impossible for Bredl to continue masking his injury, the corporate machine did not mobilize a comprehensive medical intervention. They simply removed him from the active training roster. They executed a standard, highly cynical industry protocol known as putting the talent on the shelf. To be put on the shelf in professional wrestling is to be relegated to a dark, forgotten corner of the corporate warehouse. It is not a designated period of medical rehabilitation. It is a sentence of physical and professional purgatory. Bredl was effectively sidelined, stripped of his training schedule, and left to languish. The corporation had extracted his reality television momentum, utilized their veterans to break his psychological confidence, pushed him through a training meat grinder that literally caused his brain to bleed, and the moment he became physically incapable of executing a suplex, they simply discarded him into the background. He was no longer a high-value television asset. He was a medical liability, a piece of broken machinery taking up space in the facility. The systematic refusal of the corporation to assume total long-term responsibility for his catastrophic brain injury exposes the most predatory legal fiction in the history of American entertainment: the independent contractor classification. World Wrestling Entertainment operates a global monopoly, dictating when its performers travel, what they wear, what they say on television, and precisely how they perform their physical duties. Yet through a decades-old, fiercely defended legal loophole, the company classifies these individuals not as employees, but as independent contractors. This specific classification is the ultimate corporate shield. It entirely absolves the billionaire executives from the legal requirement to provide comprehensive health insurance, workers' compensation, or long-term disability care. When Bredl's brain began to bleed as a direct result of the training regimen mandated and supervised by the company, the corporation was legally protected from assuming the devastating financial burden of his neurological care. They were not required to fund the years of specialized cognitive therapy, the endless MRI scans, or the expensive medications required to manage the severe lingering effects of a traumatic brain injury. The $250,000 contract that had initially incited the rage of the locker room was revealed to be a temporary, heavily conditioned illusion. It offered absolutely zero long-term medical security. The corporation had broken his brain, and the legal architecture of the industry allowed them to cleanly wash their hands of the medical consequences, forcing the financial devastation entirely onto the victim. However, the executives in Stanford were acutely aware that abandoning a highly publicized reality television winner with a bleeding brain presented a massive, highly volatile public relations vulnerability. If Bredl utilized his platform to speak directly to the millions of fans who had voted for him, if he exposed the toxicity of the wrestler's court, the sheer cruelty of his locker room exile, the psychopathic training methods, and the absolute lack of corporate medical support, the resulting scandal would attract the attention of mainstream sports media, labor boards, and potentially federal regulators. The corporation could not allow the narrative of his injury to breach the tightly controlled walls of the WWE media ecosystem. They required absolute silence. To achieve this, the corporate machine executed a highly sophisticated, deeply sinister suppression of his digital identity. When Bredl signed his developmental contract, he was subjected to the standard draconian clauses regarding intellectual property and social media representation. The company seized administrative control over his digital presence, specifically his verified Instagram account. In the modern economy, an athlete's social media platform is their direct line to the public, their primary mechanism for monetization, and their only unfiltered voice. Following his diagnosis and his relegation to the shelf, WWE effectively hijacked Bredl's Instagram account for a period spanning 2 entire years. They locked him out. He was completely stripped of his ability to communicate with his audience. This digital hostage situation is a terrifying demonstration of modern corporate power. The executives weaponized the contract to place a permanent gag order on a brain-damaged employee. Bredl could not post updates about his deteriorating health. He could not leverage his reality television fame to launch a crowdfunding campaign to pay for his mounting neurological medical bills. He could not publicly defend himself against the lingering online mockery initiated by the veterans months earlier. He was trapped in a silent, agonizing void. The corporation successfully orchestrated a digital blackout, starving the media cycle of any new information regarding his existence. By preventing him from speaking, they ensured that the rapid, highly distracted nature of the digital news cycle would simply forget he ever existed. The strategy of silent erasure operated with ruthless, unmitigated efficiency. For 2 years, Bredl sat in the dark, battling the terrifying cognitive symptoms of his hematoma, isolated from the industry and legally gagged by the corporation that had destroyed his health. He watched his physical vitality evaporate while the billion-dollar machine continued to produce weekly television broadcasts, entirely unbothered by the human wreckage it had left in its wake. By November 2017, the corporate public relations department determined that the strategic objective had been successfully achieved. The viewing public had completely forgotten the outcome of the 2015 season of Tough Enough. The mainstream media had moved on. The threat of a public relations crisis regarding his brain injury had been entirely neutralized by the 2-year digital quarantine. The asset was no longer a liability. It was simply irrelevant. Having successfully erased him from the public consciousness, World Wrestling Entertainment executed the final inevitable phase of their strategy. In November 2017, they officially terminated his contract. There was no press release. There was no formal announcement on the company website thanking him for his efforts. There was no severance package designed to cushion the devastating medical reality he was facing. The release was executed with a cold administrative silence. The internal roster sheet was updated. His name was deleted from the developmental database, and his security access was permanently revoked. At 26 years old, Josh Bredl was thrown back into the civilian world. He possessed no functional professional skills outside of a collegiate football resume that was now several years out of date. He was carrying the permanent, invisible scars of a severe traumatic brain injury. He was financially responsible for the ongoing exorbitant costs of his own neurological care, entirely abandoned by the corporation that had caused the damage. The reality television promise of global superstardom had been meticulously deconstructed, leaving behind nothing but a medically compromised, digitally silenced, and professionally discarded human being. The machine had successfully extracted the necessary television ratings, utilized his presence to reinforce the absolute fear-based authority of the veteran locker room, broken his physical body, hidden the evidence behind a legal firewall, and quietly swept the remains out the back door without generating a single negative headline. The immediate aftermath of a corporate termination within the professional wrestling monopoly is defined by a terrifying, absolute silence. When World Wrestling Entertainment officially severed Josh Bredl's contract in November 2017, the billion-dollar apparatus instantly disconnected him from the matrix of its global operations. There was no transition period, no exit interview offering psychological decompression, and critically, no continuation of specialized medical care for the severe traumatic brain injury he had sustained under their supervision. At 26 years old, Bredl was entirely excommunicated. He was ejected into the civilian world not as the triumphant, wealthy reality television star the public remembered from 2015, but as a medically compromised, psychologically battered piece of discarded industrial machinery. The psychological whiplash of this transition is profoundly destructive. The system had spent 2 years meticulously dismantling his self-worth through the archaic, mob-rule justice of wrestler's court, subjecting him to physical isolation and digital hostage-taking. When the termination was finally executed, he was left grappling with a fractured identity. He was a former elite collegiate athlete who had been explicitly told by the highest echelons of the entertainment industry that he was worthless, entirely unsuited for the profession they had lured him into. In a desperate, instinctual attempt to reclaim his athletic dignity and salvage his professional identity, Bredl pivoted toward the unforgiving realm of mixed martial arts, MMA. This transition is a well-documented, frequently tragic pipeline for former professional wrestlers. Stripped of the choreographed, predetermined outcomes of the wrestling ring, discarded performers often seek the absolute, undeniable truth of the MMA cage. They desire a platform where corporate politics, locker room hazing, and subjective executive opinions are irrelevant. A space where victory and defeat are dictated solely by physical competence and combat skill. However, the MMA cage is also the ultimate merciless auditor of biological health. It instantly exposes any structural weaknesses, neurological delays, or hidden physical trauma. When Bredl began his training camps for professional mixed martial arts, he was operating under a fatal misconception. He believed he was entering the sport with the elite, resilient physiology of his Colorado State University football days. He did not fully comprehend the invisible, catastrophic physiological debt he was carrying from his tenure at the WWE Performance Center. The human body is an intricate ledger. It keeps a meticulous, permanent record of every trauma it endures. The psychopathic cardiovascular conditioning drills, the relentless, unprotected impacts on the wooden wrestling canvas, the severe sleep deprivation induced by extreme psychological stress, and most importantly, the hematoma, the active bleeding inside his cranial cavity, had fundamentally altered his biological baseline. A traumatic brain injury of that magnitude does not simply heal and vanish because a corporate contract expires. It permanently compromises the central nervous system, the neural pathways responsible for split-second reaction times, spatial awareness, and the ability to instinctively absorb and deflect kinetic impact are severely degraded. In the sport of mixed martial arts, where a fraction of a second of hesitation results in concussive, unpadded strikes to the skull, this neurological degradation is a lethal liability. Bredl's professional MMA career was agonizingly brief, culminating in a highly publicized immediate defeat resulting in a permanent 0-1 record. To the untrained observer, this rapid failure was viewed simply as an athlete transitioning into the wrong sport. A forensic biological analysis, however, reveals a much darker reality. The body he brought into the cage was a hollowed-out, compromised shell. The rapid defeat was not a failure of willpower, fighting spirit, or athletic dedication. It was the undeniable manifestation of the physical ruin inflicted upon him by the WWE developmental system. The corporation had extracted the prime years of his athletic resilience, ground his central nervous system into dust through reckless training mandates, and left him entirely incapable of successfully competing in a legitimate combat sport. The WWE machine had essentially guaranteed his failure in the MMA cage years before he ever stepped inside it. Following the collapse of his mixed martial arts aspirations, Bredl entered a prolonged period of quiet, undocumented survival. Away from the blinding lights of arena television and the brutal scrutiny of the combat sports world, the invisible damage inflicted by the entertainment industry began to metastasize. Medical science has established a profound, undeniable link between severe chronic stress, traumatic brain injuries, and the long-term degradation of the human immune system. When an individual is subjected to the prolonged, inescapable psychological terror of locker room exile, coupled with the severe biological trauma of a brain bleed, the body remains trapped in a perpetual state of severe systemic inflammation. The adrenal glands are exhausted, the endocrine system is disrupted, and the cellular mechanisms responsible for fighting off external pathogens are permanently weakened. The corporate abuse Bredl endured in his 20s had essentially placed a ticking time bomb inside his immune system. In early 2024, nearly 9 years after he stood in the ring as the winner of Tough Enough, that biological time bomb finally detonated. Bredl's compromised physiological system suffered a complete catastrophic crash. He contracted a severe, highly aggressive infection that rapidly escalated into sepsis. Escalating far beyond a mere illness, sepsis triggered a life-threatening, full-body medical emergency. It occurs when an infection triggers a massive, chaotic chain reaction throughout the entire body. The immune system, entirely dysregulated and weakened by years of chronic inflammation and untreated neurological trauma, goes into overdrive, releasing toxic chemicals into the bloodstream. These chemicals trigger widespread inflammation, which rapidly leads to blood clots, leaking blood vessels, and the catastrophic, cascading failure of major internal organs. The man who had once possessed the elite physical dimensions of a Division I defensive lineman found himself lying in an intensive care unit, fighting a desperate, minute-by-minute battle simply to remain alive. The sepsis ravaged his body, pushing him to the absolute precipice of mortality. He required immediate, highly invasive surgical interventions and the deployment of massive doses of intravenous antibiotics to halt the rapid shutdown of his organs. The 2024 ICU battle was the ultimate horrifying collection of the biological debt incurred during his time in the professional wrestling industry. The corporation had demanded his physical vitality as the entry fee for their reality television programming. They had subjected him to a hazing culture that destroyed his psychological equilibrium, and they had mandated a training regimen that battered his brain until it bled. They walked away cleanly in 2017, but Bredl was forced to pay the final, agonizing installment of that debt in a hospital bed 7 years later, fighting for his life against an immune system that had forgotten how to protect him. Bredl survived the sepsis crisis, emerging from the hospital with a profoundly altered perspective on his own existence and the industry that nearly killed him. The psychological decompression following a near-death medical emergency strips away all societal illusions and corporate mythologies. Having faced the absolute finality of his own mortality, Bredl completely rejected the conditioning he had been subjected to during his 20s. The professional wrestling industry and the broader entertainment complex operates by convincing young athletes that fame, television exposure, and corporate approval are the most valuable currencies in human existence. The system demands that performers sacrifice their cartilage, their brain tissue, and their personal dignity to secure these artificial rewards. Through the crucible of his physical and neurological collapse, Bredl arrived at a definitive, unshakable counter-philosophy. He distilled his survival into a single, vital mandate. Preservation is key. This philosophy is an absolute, uncompromising rejection of the corporate meat grinder. It is the realization that a television contract, regardless of its monetary value or the size of the audience it reaches, is entirely worthless if the cost of fulfilling that contract is the permanent destruction of your biological and psychological health. Bredl now advocates for the radical protection of the self. He actively warns the next generation of athletes against the intoxicating, predatory lure of the entertainment industry. He does not speak from a position of bitterness or a desire to reclaim the spotlight he lost. He speaks from the quiet, unassailable authority of a man who survived the absolute worst the system had to offer. He tells young prospects that they must view their bodies and their minds not as resources to be extracted by billionaire executives for television ratings, but as sacred, irreplaceable assets that must be fiercely guarded. He highlights the terrifying reality that when the television cameras are turned off, the confetti is swept away, and the corporate security badge is deactivated. The athlete is left entirely alone to manage the shattered remains of their own health. If you do not prioritize your own preservation, the machine will happily consume you until you are broken, and it will never apologize for the damage it leaves behind. The comprehensive narrative of Josh Bredl serves as one of the most damning, unvarnished forensic indictments of the modern reality television apparatus and the professional wrestling monopoly. His story entirely dismantles the deeply ingrained cultural mythology that hard work and physical potential are inherently rewarded within the entertainment sector. Bredl was lured into a meticulously designed corporate trap. World Wrestling Entertainment utilized the Tough Enough platform to harvest his genuine athletic potential, converting his reality television victory into a highly profitable interactive media event. They assigned him a $250,000 contract, not as an investment in his future, but as a deliberate mechanism to ignite the territorial rage of their established locker room. The executives weaponized their own archaic, toxic culture, utilizing veteran performers to execute a campaign of brutal psychological hazing, digital humiliation, and physical isolation via the unregulated mob-rule justice of Wrestler's Court. When the psychological torture transitioned into physical devastation, the system revealed its absolute lack of medical morality. Subjected to psychopathic training mandates designed to break him, Bredl sustained a catastrophic brain bleed. The corporate response was not compassion or medical intervention, but administrative erasure. They classified him as an independent contractor to evade the financial responsibility of his neurological care, hijacked his digital identity to ensure his silence, and parked him in the dark until the public forgot his name. The true tragedy of Josh Bredl's existence is that the damage did not end with his termination. The system compromised his neurological architecture, dooming his subsequent attempt at a mixed martial arts career, and severely degraded his immune system, culminating in a near-fatal battle with sepsis nearly a decade later. Yet the ultimate conclusion of his story is not one of victimhood. It is one of profound, hard-won survival. Bredl's survival stands as a searing act of defiance against a multi-billion-dollar entity that viewed his life as completely disposable. By surviving the brain trauma, the corporate exile, and the systemic organ failure, and by emerging with the crystal-clear message that preservation is key, he reclaimed the narrative the corporation attempted to steal from him. Josh Bredl is a permanent, living warning to every aspiring athlete who looks at the flashing lights of an arena and believes the system has their best interests at heart. His life is a stark, undeniable testament to the fact that corporate entertainment machines do not build heroes. They manufacture illusions built on the broken bones, the bleeding brains, and the shattered immune systems of the young men and women they grind to dust. The machine will take everything you are willing to give it, and it is entirely up to the individual to realize that their life, their health, and their humanity are worth infinitely more than a moment of manufactured applause.